If I had to think about the technique that impacted me the most as an oil painter, the technique that really made me reach a new level and become the artist that I am today, it would be this one, drawing with paint. Doesn't seem like much, but I can assure you that once I tried it seriously for the first time, it made something click in my head and liberated my entire process for good. In this video, I want to explain to you how I draw with paint, how to start a painting with this method, but I also want to explain why this technique changed things for me at such a fundamental level. Alright, so let's first talk about how I draw with paint. I usually start with a fast drying pigment, either raw umber or burnt umber. Raw umber has a more yellow-brown, sometimes slightly greenish hue, not very dark. It creates a very nice background to start portraits and figure painting. Really fits the range of the human cutters. It looks very natural. When I use raw umber, I usually complement it with ivory black. And don't worry about the ivory black, which normally has a pretty bad drying time. Raw umber dries so fast that it will be touch dry within hours, so no problems there. The other fast drying pigment I use is burnt umber. It's the same pigment but calcined, burnt, which makes it darker and more red-orange in hue. It's typically a dark brown. Now, I find this color less pleasant by itself, but its greatest benefit is that it can create a black when mixed with ultramarine blue. So this is what I usually use. It's basically like painting with a black that can be more or less warm or cool. I find that it works really well for drawing because it feels very similar to charcoal, but fluid. Charcoal that you would apply with a brush, basically. If you're familiar with charcoal, this technique will feel very natural to you. And it can really help you transition from drawing to painting. If you don't know exactly how to proceed, you can start with exercises doing this technique and it will help you improve a lot, I can assure you that. And obviously, after that, you have your fast drying pigment and you can always add an extra pigment to change the hue. Like for example, phthalo blue, in this case, pulls the mix towards more the cyan side and can make the color much stronger. You can use any pigment of your choice diluted with a mineral spirits, as long as there is at least one fast drying pigment in the mix for the underpainting. The brushes I like to use at this stage are pretty affordable and they usually look like this. One big hawk bristle brush, a filbert to spread a lot of paint very fast. Also big fat synthetic rounds to trace thick lines and a couple of small rounds to get more precision when needed. The good thing about the rounds is that if you press very hard on the brush, it gives you a very thick line. And if you press very lightly, it gives you something quite precise and thin. So a great amount of variety in there. It's almost like a calligraphy brush in a way. And obviously, you'll also need a couple of small rounds to get more precision when needed, for example, for the faces. I also use a spalter for the wash and rags, lots of rags in this stage. It can get messy, so use latex gloves, and if you use odorless mineral spirits like me, make sure to do it in a well-ventilated studio. But of course, the same thing could also be done with water mixable oil paints if you prefer. If it's the path that you choose, make sure to dilute the paint with the dedicated water mixable paint thinner and not only water, because water alone doesn't have a great fluidity and creates this annoying milky discoloration with water mixable oil paint. I'll be brief on this technical part today because it's not the subject of this video, so if you're still not clear about materials and techniques like what kind of brushes to use, what exactly is water mixable oil paint and the rest, you can check my oil painting course. Is designed to help precisely with all this technical side of painting and comes with detailed demonstration exploring portrait, still life and landscape, but also with all the technical aspects on this side. So if you want to learn more, you can just follow the link below. The first type of technique that I use is a wash. I simply dip a large brush like a spalter in odorless mineral spirits and spread a thin wash on the canvas. You can do the same with water mixable paint thinner if you have this type of paint. This wash is important because it will open the surface and bring fluidity in the early stage. Basically, the idea is that it makes the paint very fluid because the entire canvas is wet at first. So the lines are very rough and thick in the beginning, and then as it slowly dries, within a couple of hours, usually the lines can become progressively more precise. So the drying time of the wash is the perfect companion of the drawing process. In a drawing, you usually go from big to small, from simple to complex. The process usually starts with thick lines, very blocky and approximative, and then lines and edges are progressively refined within the first few hours. And with this wash, because it is drying progressively within this exact time frame, it's kind of the perfect fit to do your drawing at the same time as you refine your lines. To erase, you can fold a little piece of paper towel or a small piece of lint-free cloth, and with that you can shape it however you want and erase or reshape your line. I like to start with thick lines because I know that the right line is somewhere in there, but I might not have all the information I need at the right moment to decide where exactly the precise, sharp line should be. So I don't go for this type of sharp line. I leave it like this and I go do something else and continue the drawing while it's slowly drying. And when I have more information, I come back to this and I refine it. I shape it from both sides until I get a more precise indication of where exactly the line is supposed to be. You can also lift off the wash and reveal the white canvas to bring some highlights back. You can decide to shade at this point. It's not going to necessarily be perfect, but it can give you a decent approximation of the values of your shadow shapes. You can dilute the paint slightly and use various degrees of dilution to create different levels of value. I usually skip this phase because it doesn't really add much to my blocking, and I have a very complete process focused on value in the overpainting coming up. So it doesn't add much to my personal process here. It takes a lot of time, so I only shade when I need to get more focus and more precision, but I don't spend a lot of time there. Once I have my proportions, my shadow shapes, my edges, I usually don't do the shading and the values at this stage. The dry brush technique involves using a small amount of paint on a brush with very little solvent or oil medium. This technique allows to create textures and rough brush strokes that can add an interesting dimension to your paintings at this stage. It's usually the technique that you're going to use near the end of this underpainting phase when the wash is completely dry. You dip your brush into the paint, make sure to only pick up a small amount of paint, and you don't want your brush to be too wet with solvent or with oil. You want to remove excess paint and excess fluids. You wipe off any excess fluid and paint on a piece of paper towel or cloth, and the brush should feel almost dry to the touch. Apply the paint to the canvas using short, quick strokes and shade by scrubbing it lightly into the grain of the canvas. You can experiment with different brush sizes and pressures to create interesting textures and effects. A hog bristle will generally work pretty well here, and be aware that this technique damages the brushes very quickly because it's dry rubbing, so use cheap brushes only. It allows you to establish a very textured base layer that you can build upon with more detailed brushwork later. It really has a very drawing-like feeling. So this demonstration that you're looking at right now is how I normally use the techniques that I described to draw with paint and start my projects with painted outlines rather than a pencil drawing or an oil transfer. In this case, I use a mix of burnt umber and ultramarine blue with a small touch of phthalo blue to get a stronger blue tint. And I just have a simple grid here that helps me make sure that I have the appropriate size for my drawing and also and also to aim for the main focus points of the composition around the thirds and the center lines. These lines have been traced with a pencil, so you see that it resists the dilution with the solvent. I usually start with a sketch in my sketchbook that has the same proportions as my canvas. This way I can easily transpose my project to the real canvas, and I avoid the very common issue of having a figure that's either too small or too big. Starting an oil painting by drawing directly with a paintbrush rather than using a pencil or transferring a drawing has helped me a lot. It has really liberated my approach. Before that, I often used to make a preparatory drawing on paper separately and use an oil transfer to get the outline transferred on my canvas. It works, but for my paintings, I find that it really kills the spontaneity. Plus, it gives you a false sense of confidence, but when you start painting, the thin outline that you get at the very beginning with the transfer is not much help. Paint is fluid, so if you rely on a tiny line to make sure that your edges are right, you deprive the paint of its natural fluidity. It's normal for the paint to go over the line. It's not a coloring book, so ultimately a sharp outline is a false sense of confidence, but it doesn't really help when the actual painting starts with actual paint, heavy, thick, and fluid and moving around. If you don't believe me, you can even try transferring a photo. You print it and you transfer it with tracing paper. You technically would get the exact likeness in the outline, but when the time comes to paint, the thin lines get blurred out and you lose them, and all of a sudden you don't know what to do. Transferring a drawing can be tedious, and it's not necessarily better for accuracy and likeness. By drawing directly with a paintbrush, you avoid this process altogether and you learn how to trust your eye and your hand, which is a key here. When you draw with paint directly, you don't try to achieve a super sharp outline, but rather a basic position for the shapes that will be painted later on. You don't try to get the exact lightness from the get-go, but rather you learn how to take the time to build it up progressively, with each new stage in the painting getting you closer to the likeness that you desire. On the opposite side, with a transferred outline, you start with the exact likeness, but you progressively lose it by painting. And this is not the right way to work. Drawing with paint brings a much better sense of progression. It teaches you to go from simple to complex, whereas a transferred outline tries to give you the finished drawing right away so that you paint over it, but you lose it at the same time. So I hope that you understand how fundamental this difference can be in how you approach your painting. Drawing directly with a paintbrush has a lot more benefits. One, it's faster and more efficient than transferring a drawing or sketching with a pencil directly on the canvas. A pencil drawing takes a long time, so you delay the start of the actual painting with paint. This is especially important if you're working on a large canvas, and past a certain size, it takes way too long to first make a preparatory drawing with a pencil, and it becomes much more efficient to start with paint immediately. When you draw with a paintbrush directly, you can also capture the essence of your subject more quickly and expressively. You can create loose and expressive brushstrokes that convey the energy and feeling of your subject. This approach can lead to a more dynamic and lively painting. And to me, this spontaneity is key because it's a source of inspiration. Sometimes you'll find a new idea just by feeling it with the paintbrush in your hand, but you didn't think about it in your preparation stage. Only when you have the real canvas in front of you, the real size, a real paintbrush in your hand, you have this, illumination moment when you say, hey, wait a minute, I can do this or that, and it changes everything. It gives a greater flexibility and allows you to have easy last-minute change of plans. You can adjust your drawing as you go. something that you wouldn't necessarily do with a pencil because it's slow and tedious to draw with a pencil. And even erase with a pencil is a slow and tedious process. With a paintbrush drawing, you can try something, and as long as you wipe it off before it's dry, you can try different things. You have time. For example, you want to try 2 or 3 different positions for an arm, simply draw them with paint and erase what you don't like. You usually have 3 to 4 hours of erasable working time, so that's why it's so easy to correct mistakes and make adjustments. Finally, when you draw with a paintbrush, you are directly engaged with the painting from the get-go. This can help you to develop a stronger connection with your subject and create a more cohesive and unified painting. It helps preventing discouragement as it gives you immediate artistic satisfaction. And in fact, it's one of my favorite parts of the painting process. It's exciting, it's a rush. Overall, drawing directly with a paintbrush in an oil painting can lead to a more spontaneous, expressive, and flexible approach that allows you to capture the essence of your subject more quickly, more artistically. This can be the difference between a boring pencil outline that you have to cover with paint and the new unexpected inspiration that you could only find with a paintbrush in your hand that makes all the difference. Try it. Trust your eye, trust your hand, and let me know how it goes for you. If you want to watch a video with a great exercise that you can do to gain confidence in your painting skills, you can click here or here somewhere. A huge thank you to everyone supporting me on Patreon. This video wouldn't be possible without you. The link is in the description below. You'll also find the links to both my courses, my oil painting course and my color course. Alright, that's it for today, and as always my friends, joy and inspiration to you. Bye.